Chapter 9 of Pioneers of France in the New World, Part 2, Champlain and His Associates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pioneers of France in the New World by Francis Parkman, Part 2, Samuel Champlain and His Associates, Chapter 9, Champlain at Quebec, 1608–1609. A lonely ship sailed up the St. Lawrence. The white whales floundering in the bay of Tadoussac, and the wild duck diving as the foam prow drew near, there was no life but these in all that watery solitude, 20 miles from shore to shore. The ship was from Honfleur, and was commanded by Samuel de Champlain. He was the Aeneas of a destined people, and in her womb lay the embryo life of Canada. De Monts, after his exclusive privilege of trade was revoked and his Acadian enterprise ruined, had, as we have seen, abandoned it to Poutrincourt. Perhaps it would have been well for him had he abandoned it with all transatlantic enterprises, but the passion for discovery and the noble ambition of founding colonies had taken possession of his mind. These, rather than a mere hope of gain, seem to have been his controlling motives. Yet the profits of the fur trade were vital to the new designs he was meditating, to meet the heavy outlay they demanded, and he solicited and obtained a fresh monopoly of the traffic for 1 year. Champlain was at the time in Paris, but his unquiet thoughts turned westward. He was enamoured of the New World, whose rugged charms had seized his fancy and his heart, and as explorers of Arctic seas have pined in their repose for polar ice and snow, so did his restless thoughts revert to the fog-wrapped coasts, the piny odours of forests, the noise of waters, the sharp and piercing sunlight, so dear to his remembrance. He longed to unveil the mystery of that boundless wilderness, and plant the Catholic faith and the power of France amid its ancient barbarism. 5 years before, he had explored the St. Lawrence as far as the rapids above Montreal, was the true site for a settlement, a fortified post, whence, as from a secure basis, the waters of the vast interior might be traced back towards their sources, and a westward route discovered to China and Japan. For the fur trade, too, the innumerable streams that descended to the great river might all be closed against foreign intrusion by a single fort at some commanding point, and made tributary to a rich and permanent commerce, while, and this was nearer to his heart, for he had often been heard to say that the saving of a soul was worth more than the conquest of an empire, countless savage tribes, in the bondage of Satan, might by the same avenues be reached and redeemed. De Mounts embraced his views, and fitting out 2 ships, gave command of one to the elder Pontgrave, of the other to Champlain. The former was to trade with the Indians and bring back the cargo of furs which, it was hoped, would meet the expense of the voyage. To Champlain fell the harder task of settlement and exploration. Pontgrave, laden with goods for the Indian trade of Tadoussac, sailed from Honfleur on the 5th of April, 1608. Champlain, with men, arms, and stores for the colony, followed 8 days later. On the 15th of May he was on the Grand Bank, on the 30th he passed Gaspé, and on the 3rd of June neared Tadoussac. No living thing was to be seen. He anchored, lowered a boat, and rowed into the port, round the rocky point at the southeast, then, from the fury of its winds and currents, called La Pente de tous les Diables. There was life enough within, and more than he cared to find. In the still anchorage under the cliffs lay Pontgrave's vessel, and at her side another ship, which proved to be a Basque fur trader. Pontgrave, arriving a few days before, had found himself anticipated by the Basques, who were busied in a brisk trade with bands of Indians cabined along the borders of the cove. He displayed the royal letters, and commanded a cessation of the prohibited traffic; but the Basques proved refractory, declared that they would trade in spite of the king, fired on Pontgrave with cannon and musketry, wounded him and 2 of his men, and killed a 3rd. They then boarded his vessel, and carried away all his cannon, small arms, and ammunition, saying that they would restore them when they had finished their trade and were ready to return home. Champlain found his comrade on shore, in a disabled condition. The Basques, though still strong enough to make fight, were alarmed for the consequences of their conduct, and anxious to come to terms. A peace, therefore, was signed on board their vessel, all differences were referred to the judgment of the French courts, harmony was restored, and the choleric strangers betook themselves to catching whales. This port of Tadoussac was long the centre of the Canadian fur trade. A desolation of barren mountains closes round it, betwixt whose ribs of rugged granite, bristling with savins, birches, and firs, the Saguenay rolls its gloomy waters from the northern wilderness. Centuries of civilization have not tamed the wildness of the place, and still, in grim repose, the mountains hold their guard against the wave like lake that glistens in their shadow, and doubles in its sullen mirror crag, precipice, and forest. Near the brink of the cove or harbor where the vessel lay, and a little below the mouth of a brook which formed one of the outlets of this small lake, stood the remains of the wooden barrack built by Chauvin 8 years before. Above the brook were the lodges of an Indian camp, stacks of poles covered with birch bark. They belonged to an Algonquin horde, called Montagnais, denizens of surrounding wilds, and gatherers of their only harvest, skins of the moose, caribou, and bear, fur of the beaver, marten, otter, fox, wild cat, and lynx. Nor was this all, for there were intermediate traders betwixt the French and the shivering bands who roamed the weary stretch of stunted forest between the head waters of the Saguenay and Hudson's Bay. Indefatigable canoe-men, in their birchen vessels, light as egg-shells, they threaded the devious tracks of countless rippling streams, shady byways of the forest, where the wild duck scarcely finds depth to swim, then descended to their mart along those scenes of picturesque yet dreary grandeur which steam has made familiar to modern tourists. With slowly moving paddles they glided beneath the cliff whose shaggy brows frown across the zenith, and whose base the deep waves wash with a hoarse and hollow cadence, and they passed the sepulchre bay of the Trinity, dark as the tide of Acheron, a sanctuary of solitude and silence, depths which, as the fable runs, no sounding line can fathom, and heights at whose dizzy verge the wheeling eagle seems a speck. Peace being established with the Basques, and the wounded Pontgrave busied, as far as might be, in transferring to the hold of his ship the rich lading of the Indian canoes, Champlain spread his sails, and again held his course up the St. Lawrence. Far to the south, in sun and shadow, slumbered the woody mountains whence fell the countless springs of the St. John, behind tenantless shores, now white with glimmering villages, La Cheniac, Granville, Kamouraska, St. Roch, St. Jean, Vancelot, Berthier. But on the north the jealous wilderness still asserts its sway, crowding to the river's verge its walls, domes, and towers of granite, and to this hour its solitude is scarcely broken. Above the point of the island of Orleans, a constriction of the vast channel narrows it to less than a mile, with the green heights of Point Levis on the one side, and on the other the cliffs of Quebec. Here a small stream, the St. Charles, enters the St. Lawrence, and in the angle betwixt them rises the promontory on two sides, a natural fortress. Between the cliffs and the river lay a strand covered with walnuts and other trees. From this strand, by a rough passage gullied downward from the place where Prescott Gate now guards the way, one might climb the height to the broken plateau above, now burdened with its ponderous load of churches, convents, dwellings, ramparts, and batteries. Thence, by a gradual ascent, the rock sloped upward to its highest summit, Cape Diamond, looking down on the St. Lawrence from a height of 350 feet. Here the citadel now stands; then the fierce sun fell on the bald, baking rock, with its crisped mosses and parched lichens. 2 centuries and a half have quickened the solitude with swarming life, covered the deep bosom of the river with barge and steamer and gliding sail, and reared cities and villages on the site of forests, but nothing can destroy the surpassing grandeur of the scene. On the strand between the water and the cliffs Champlain's axemen fell to their work. They were pioneers of an advancing host, advancing, it is true, with feeble and uncertain progress, priests, soldiers, peasants, feudal scutcheons, royal insignia, not the Middle Age, but engendered of it by the stronger life of modern centralization, sharply stamped with a parental likeness, heir to parental weakness and parental force. In a few weeks a pile of wooden buildings rose on the brink of the St. Lawrence, on or near the site of the market-place of the lower town of Quebec. The pencil of Champlain, always regardless of proportion and perspective, has preserved its likeness. A strong wooden wall, surmounted by a gallery loopholed for musketry, enclosed 3 buildings, containing quarters for himself and his men, together with a courtyard, from one side of which rose a tall dovecot, like a belfry. A moat surrounded the whole, and 2 or 3 small cannon were planted on salient platforms towards the river. There was a large storehouse near at hand, and a part of the adjacent ground was laid out as a garden. In this garden Champlain was one morning directing his labourers, when Tetu, his pilot, approached him with an anxious countenance, and muttered a request to speak with him in private. Champlain assenting, they withdrew to the neighbouring woods, when the pilot disburdened himself of his secret. One Antoine Natel, a locksmith, smitten by conscience or fear, had revealed to him a conspiracy to murder his commander, and deliver Quebec into the hands of the Basques and Spaniards, then at Tadoussac. Another locksmith, named Duval, was author of the plot, and, with the aid of 3 accomplices, had befooled or frightened nearly all the company into taking part of it. Each was assured that he should make his fortune; all were mutually pledged to poignard the first betrayer of the secret. The critical point of their enterprise was the killing of Champlain. Some were for strangling him, some for raising a false alarm in the night and shooting him as he came out from his quarters. Having heard the pilot's story, Champlain, remaining in the woods, desired his informant to find Antoine Natel, and bring him to the spot. Natel soon appeared, trembling with excitement and fear, and a close examination left no doubt of the truth of his statement. A small vessel, built by Pontgrave at Tadoussac, had lately arrived, and orders were now given that it should anchor close at hand. On board was a young man in whom confidence could be placed. Champlain sent him 2 bottles of wine, with a direction to tell the 4 ringleaders that they had been given him by his Basque friends at Tadoussac, and to invite them to share the good cheer. They came aboard in the evening, and were seized and secured. "Voilà donc mes galants bien estonnés," writes Champlain. It was 10 o'clock, and most of the men on shore were asleep. They were wakened suddenly, and told of the discovery of the plot and the arrest of the ringleaders. Pardon was then promised them, and they were dismissed again to their beds, greatly relieved, for they had lived in trepidation, each fearing the other. Duval's body, swinging from a gibbet, gave wholesome warning to those he had seduced, and his head was displayed on a pike, from the highest roof of the buildings, food for birds and a lesson to sedition. His 3 accomplices were carried by Pontgrave to France, where they made their atonement in the galleys. It was on the 18th of September that Pontgrave set sail, leaving Champlain and 28 men to hold Quebec through the winter. 3 weeks later, and shores and hills glowed with gay prognostics of approaching desolation: the yellow and scarlet of the maples, the deep purple of the ash, the garnet hue of young oaks, the crimson of the tupelo at the water's edge, and the golden plumage of birch saplings in fissures in the cliffs. It was a short-lived beauty. The forest dropped its festal robes. Shrivelled and faded, they rustled to the earth. The crystal air and laughing sun of October passed away, and November sank upon the shivering waste, chill and sombre as the tomb. A roving band of Montagnais had built their huts near the buildings, and were busying themselves with their autumnal eel fishery, on which they greatly relied to sustain their miserable lives through the winter. Their slimy harvest being gathered, and duly smoked and dried, they gave it for safe keeping to Champlain, and set out to hunt beavers. It was deep in the winter before they came back, reclaimed their eels, built their birch cabins again, and disposed themselves for a life of ease, until famine or their enemies should put an end to their enjoyments. These were by no means without alloy. While gorged with food, they lay dozing on piles of branches in their smoky huts, where, through the crevices of the thin birch bark, streamed in a cold capable of times at congealing mercury. Their slumbers were beset with nightmare visions of Iroquois forays, scalpings, butcherings, and burnings. As dreams were their oracles, the camp was wild with fright. They sent out no scouts and placed no guard, but with each repetition of these nocturnal terrors, they came flocking in a body to beg admission within the fort. The women and children were allowed to enter the yard and remain during the night, while anxious fathers and jealous husbands shivered in the darkness without. On one occasion, a group of wretched beings was seen on the farther bank of the St. Lawrence, like wild animals driven by famine to the borders of the settlers' clearing. The river was full of drifting ice, and there was no crossing without risk of life. The Indians, in their desperation, made the attempt, and midway their canoes were ground to atoms among the tossing masses. Agile as wildcats, they all leaped upon a huge raft of ice, the squaws carrying their children on their shoulders, a feat at which Champlain marvelled when he saw their starved and emaciated condition. Here they began a wail of despair, when happily the pressure of other masses thrust the sheet of ice against the northern shore. They landed, and soon made their appearance at the fort, worn to skeletons and horrible to look upon. The French gave them food, which they devoured with a frenzied avidity, and, unappeased, fell upon a dead dog left on the snow by Champlain for 2 months past as a bait for foxes. They broke this carrion into fragments, and thawed and devoured it, to the disgust of the spectators, who tried vainly to prevent them. This was but a severe access of the periodical famine which, during the winter, was a normal condition of the Algonquin tribes of Acadia and the lower St. Lawrence, who, unlike the cognate tribes of New England, never tilled the soil, or made any reasonable provision against the time of need. One would gladly know how the founders of Quebec spent the long hours of their first winter, but on this point the only man among them, perhaps, who could write, has not thought it necessary to enlarge. He himself beguiled his leisure with trapping foxes, or hanging a dead dog from a tree and watching the hungry martens in their efforts to reach it. Towards the close of winter, all found abundant employment in nursing themselves or their neighbours, for the inevitable scurvy broke out with a virulence. At the middle of May, only 8 men of the 28 were alive, and half of these were suffering from disease. This wintry purgatory wore away; the icy stalactites that hung from the cliffs fell crashing to the earth; the clamour of the wild geese was heard; the bluebirds appeared in the naked woods; the water willows were covered with their soft caterpillar-like blossoms; the twigs of the swamp maple were flushed with ruddy bloom; the ash hung out its black tufts; the shad bush seemed a wreath of snow; the white stars of the bloodroot gleamed among the dank fallen leaves; and in the young grass of the wet meadows the marsh marigolds shone like spots of gold. Great was the joy of Champlain when, on the 5th of June, he saw a sailboat rounding the Point of Orleans, betokening that spring had brought with it the longed for succours. A son in law of Pontgrave, named Maret, was on board, and he reported that Pontgrave was then at Tadoussac, where he had lately arrived. Thither Champlain hastened, to take counsel with his comrade. His constitution or his courage had defied the scurvy. They met, and it was determined betwixt them, that, while Pontgrave remained in charge of Quebec, Champlain should enter at once on his long meditated explorations, by which, like La Salle 70 years later, he had good hope of finding a way to China. But there was a lion in the path. The Indian tribes, to whom peace was unknown, invested with their scalping parties the streams and pathways of the forest, and increased tenfold its inseparable risks. The after career of Champlain gives abundant proof that he was more than indifferent to all such chances; yet now an expedient for evading them offered itself, so consonant with his instincts that he was glad to accept it. During the last autumn a young chief from the banks of the then unknown Ottawa had been at Quebec, and, amazed at what he saw, he had begged Champlain to join him in the spring against his enemies. These enemies were a formidable race of savages, the Iroquois, or 5 confederate nations, who dwelt in fortified villages within limits now embraced by the state of New York, and who were a terror to all the surrounding forests. They were deadly foes of their kindred the Hurons, who dwelt on the lake which bears their name, and were allies of Algonquin bands on the Ottawa. All alike were tillers of the soil, living at ease when compared with the famished Algonquins of the lower St. Lawrence. By joining these Hurons and Algonquins against their Iroquois enemies, Champlain might make himself the indispensable ally and leader of the tribes of Canada, and at the same time fight his way to discovery in regions which otherwise were barred against him. From first to last it was the policy of France and America to mingle in Indian politics, hold the balance of power between adverse tribes, and envelop in the network of her power and diplomacy the remotest hordes of the wilderness. Of this policy the father of New France may perhaps be held to have set a rash and premature example. Yet while he was apparently following the dictates of his own adventurous spirit, it became evident, a few years later, that under his thirst for discovery and spirit of knight-errantry lay a consistent and deliberate purpose. That it had already assumed a definite shape is not likely, but his after course makes it plain that, in embroiling himself and his colony with the most formidable savages on the continent, he was by no means acting so recklessly as at first sight would appear. Chapter 9